Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to resume the program. I just had a fascinating conversation with Congressman Will Hurd about impeachment, but I can't tell you about it. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Drew Duff, who is Vice Chairman of the Center for the National Interest, and in his spare time, Managing Director and founding partner of Seguler Duff, a global investment firm. He's responsible for directing the firm's private equity investment strategy. Drew, behind his affable exterior, is not simply a highly successful businessman, but when I accompanied him a few years ago in 2016 when the center hosted a speech by Donald Trump that you may have heard of, Drew and I walked over together to the Mayflower, and he displayed reporting skills that I thought I possessed, and could only end up envying. He managed to be the first person to extract from the Secret Service the code name of Donald Trump, which was Mogul. And he proudly informed me of this. I am delighted to invite Drew now to come and address us.
Thank you, Jacob, and congratulations on the success of the National Interest. It really is something extraordinary to be the most read online foreign policy journal in the world. I have great respect for foreign affairs, but I've been told that the demographic of foreign affairs is such that most people who read foreign affairs don't know how to use a computer. So hats off for capturing the next generation of foreign policy thinkers and practitioners. I joined the center about 3 years ago, and not just because of its illustrious board, not just because of Dimitri's great leadership, Chuck Boyd's great leadership, Graham Allison, who was my professor at Harvard, Henry Kissinger there at the founding, but because it aligned with my own experiences in the business world, whether that was China or Russia or the Middle East. And that a rational and realistic approach to foreign policy would foster not just a stronger United States, but also a more peaceful and prosperous world. And I'm also in awe all the time of the convening power of the Center for the National Interest. It's a place where, as Graham said, Americans of any and every political stripe can come and have a rational conversation. Foreign ministers, prime ministers, presidents, military personnel can all come and discuss important topics of the day. And so I'd like to congratulate Dimitri. I'd like to congratulate General Chuck Boyd for having led the center to where we are today, and the original founders for bringing us to this 25th anniversary moment. It's my great honor to introduce General Chuck Boyd tonight, and he's the other reason why I joined the center. His leadership, his judgment, his quiet accomplishments are something to behold in a manner that very, very few Americans exhibit. As chairman of the center, Chuck's been an example to anyone who's interested in public service and serving their country, and someone to whom we owe a debt of gratitude. On April 22nd, 1966, on his 105th mission in Vietnam, Chuck's plane was shot down, and he was held in captivity, often brutally, for the next 2,488 days. Each one, I'm sure, is deeply ingrained in his memory. Chuck could have returned home embittered or withdrawn. Instead, he recommitted himself to service to his country. Before coming to the center, Chuck had a most distinguished career in the Air Force, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Forces in Europe, Vice Commander of the Strategic Air Command's 8th Air Force, Director of Plans at Air Force Headquarters here in D.C. He was Commander at the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base. And Chuck finished his career as a 4-star general. And in fact, he's the only Vietnam War prisoner of war to become a 4-star general. So while many talk the talk, Chuck Boyd has truly walked the walk. So please join me in introducing someone to whom we all owe a great debt of gratitude. Please welcome General Charles G. Chuck Boyd.
More than I deserved. Hardly. This is a birthday party, and I haven't seen much celebration going on just yet. There was talk earlier of getting a birthday cake out here and 25 candles on it, and then get the chairman to come and blow out the candles. As soon as that idea came to me, it stopped right there. We had some interesting and also true things said about the center tonight, and yet I want to talk about one little piece of it that hasn't been mentioned and I think has been critical. And it's the piece that had to do with the lubricant that kept this thing going, particularly in the early years. And that had to do with a fellow named Hank Greenberg. I've known Hank for a long time, both in my association here and also during the years that I was running Ben's. And to me, there are two things about Hank. I always think of him as a skinny little 17-year-old in a landing craft, and when the gangplank goes down, he runs out there and drops down into the water, and somehow or another makes it up to the beach and across the beach when 2,400 of his colleagues didn't make it across that beach. On with Patton's Third Army for the rest of the war in Europe. Back home, got an education, went back to Korea, this time as an officer and a company commander in Korea. He never says anything about that, and most people don't know anything about that. But that's the way I think about him. I also think, what he did, what he accomplished as a titan in the business world, building the world's largest insurance company with a presence in 130 countries and whatever. That's amazing, but I'm still most impressed about what that kid did on the 6th of June. What I never knew until very recently is the relationship that Hank Greenberg had with President Nixon. Until I saw some correspondence he shared with me, personal letters, numerous personal letters, both before when President Nixon was in office and later, and run up to the creation of this think tank. And what President Nixon wanted from Hank was to make sure that there was enough lubricant to keep this thing rolling, especially in the early years, and that he did with amazing generosity. And I'm not so sure that any of us would be here tonight in these settings had it not been for him. And I just wanted to make that a note on this birthday that we're now celebrating. The second point, and this is a hard part now, I'm supposed to have given the task to introduce a man who is one of the best known figures in the world. I suspect a significant fraction of those who are here tonight came because they knew he was going to be here and speaking. And they know everything about him. There are probably people here that have read all 30 of the books that he's written in his life. So what is it that I'm going to say to you that you don't know about Henry Kissinger? Well, there may be one little thing that you don't know, and I'm going to tell you about that. Dr. Kissinger has a little fan club, and it was about 600 strong. It's diminished over time with age and a lot of flights westward. But that little club were people that had found their ways into the prison cells of North Vietnam. And when they came home, starting on the 12th of February 1973, although they had an awful lot of things on their minds, one question they all wanted to know was, how did this war end? And as that knowledge became available to them, they began to, and what they wanted to know was if they had made all of the commitment that they had made for nothing. What they learned, and of course they gave credit to their president, but they also learned that the guy that did the heavy lifting in Paris, in making all of those little pieces come together that allowed them to be able to be proud that they had what they had done and what they had served was not in vain. So Henry Kissinger was the one that little, and if they were, the ones that remain, there's about half of us left, if they were here tonight, they would all be standing and clapping at the fact that they were going to get to hear. So there, I will say this to the world's, to one of our greatest diplomats, along with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and from that little, what's left of that little group of 600, may I say, sir, what a great respect that we all have for you. One more thing, this is a twofer tonight. And the other half of the twofer here is one of my favorite sailors. I don't have very many of those. The 17th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man who did everything in the Navy that anybody could possibly do, and who served two presidents in such a way that no one knew when he left that job as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs what his own personal political affiliations were. General Mike Mullen. And now, please, and whatever it takes to get up here on the stage, please come.
Do you mind if I sit there?
No,
Because
that's
I
fine.
don't see with
Yeah.
my...
That's fine. All set. Well, good evening, Dr. Kissinger. To say it's an honor to spend a few minutes with you and facilitate, hopefully, some good answers to interesting questions is a real privilege. I also want to say thanks to Dimitri and others who are here, Chuck Boyd, who mentored me actually as I got into that job and has become a great friend and is a great American. My good friend Norty Schwartz, we work together very closely, and there are others as well, Ambassador Antonov, who I ended up negotiating the New START Treaty in 2010 with, et cetera. So I was asked by General Boyd a few months ago if I would sit down and have a conversation with Dr. Kissinger, and that's a very intimidating experience, or at least anticipating it. So I thought I'd ask you just a couple questions. I don't think they will surprise you. And first, I'd like to go back to 2012 when you invited me to go to China with you. We actually went to we were there, I think, 3 days with a group. It was new to me. I was freshly out of the military, and needless to say, when Dr. Kissinger goes to China, you see all the dignitaries, including Xi Jinping at the time, who was the premier. And we had a wonderful dinner that night, one of the nights there. And one of the highlights of the dinner was all night long there were these two individuals trying to get up to the head table, and security kept pushing them away and pushing them away. And this was the 50th anniversary of the 72 trip when we had open negotiations or established relationships with China. And finally, at the end of the night, these two individuals made it to the head table. You were sitting next to Xi Jinping. And it turns out they were the interpreters for Dr. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai at the time of the negotiations. And to watch, and then they translated that to Xi Jinping, and just to sit at that table and to watch the joy and happiness and reunion just among the four, the two interpreters and Xi Jinping and you, was a pretty special moment to observe. And actually one of my thoughts as I looked at it is there still is hope we can get this right with China. Xi Jinping, at one point that night, asked you what it took to be a great leader. And I don't remember what your answer was, but that was 2012, it's 2019 now. You were in China very recently, and I just, in a few words, how do you see what's evolved over those 7 or 8 years with Xi Jinping and our relationship now, and what we need to understand about our relationship in the future?
Before I answer this question, I want to say a word about the introduction, because it caught the essence of what Vietnam meant to so many of us. For those of us who were at high levels of the government, there were many practical problems. But for the people like General Paul and General and others who were in prison there and kept the faith and maintained their respect, their self-respect, and didn't break, that was an enormous tribute to the strength of our country. I, sitting in the White House, had the honor of inviting the wives of these prisoners who were under tremendous pressure from the media to renounce what the war was about. And they stood with their husbands, and they stood with America in that period. And to me, the turning point in American thinking has been the experience of the Vietnam War. That was the first time that a significant percentage of the elite advocated measures, if not to defeat their country, to believe that it was better for their country to lose the war than to prevail. And we haven't fully overcome this yet. And much of our debate is on this issue. So I cannot tell you how moved I was, and also what a pleasure and honor it is to be here with Admiral Mullen. I've never seen a better chairman, and not many comparable chairmen. Now, to answer your question, say a few profound words about China. A fundamental problem in the world today is whether China and the United States can find a way to coexist without war and without one side being asked to surrender to the other. That is the biggest challenge of our period for a number of reasons. We are two countries as different in our cultural background as it is possible to be. We look at the world as inherently stable. And if there is instability, we think there's a specific cause that has to be removed, after which the natural harmony will reassert itself. So we think problems are soluble. The Chinese think that every problem is an introduction to another set of problems. And so they are thinking about the historical process while we think about its manifestations. So a dialogue between the two sides has always some incongruous elements in it to get them on the same page. The Chinese represent a significant potential military threat to the United States. And they have the capacity to expand that. We have in the past always believed that you can remove these threats totally in the end. That is very difficult under modern conditions. But we each have to do what we're doing. So we cannot start disarming in order to create a favorable atmosphere. We have to be strong to maintain the conflict that is inherent. What is new in this situation is that when technology is so complex and so widespread and so ambiguous that you cannot know all of its implications, the direct confrontations are not have the risk of creating calamities. So anybody studying the outbreak of World War I has to be struck by the fact that on July 1st, 1914, none of the leaders believed they were going into any conflict. Right. By the end of the month, they had created an unmanageable situation. So we have to prevent hegemony of any country, including China, in the world. But we now have to do it as part of a process in which we merge diplomacy and military capacity, not in a sequence the way we usually think, that we fight a war, then we do diplomacy. We have to merge diplomacy and capacity in such a manner that we can prevent the security dangers that we want to avoid. This is a novel task for us because we've always thought of it in a more sequential fashion. And it's an effort that isn't going to have a quick ending, but it has to be conducted over an extended period of time. So one of the big challenges we have is to develop a concept of strategy that we can sustain over an indefinite period, and that we do for our national policy what the military academies are doing for our military strategy, namely train people to think of the task ahead of us. And I mention this because what this center is doing and what the quarterly is doing is to begin laying the basis for this. I worked with President Nixon. It was a strange relationship because I had been the principal advisor of his chief opponent. Yeah. And when Nixon offered me the position, I said, I have to check with Nelson Rockefeller because I've worked for him for 15 years. So anyone who wants to progress in this world should not think that that's a good way to get ahead. But when I then went to Rockefeller and asked him, he said something very important. He said, have you thought about the fact that Nixon is taking a bigger risk on you than you on him? And it showed that he thought the national interest was the dominant element. And there were a few maxims of Nixon. One was, you pay the same price for doing something halfway as for doing it completely. So you might as well start by doing it completely. That was a very important element. And when you look at his presidency, when he had decisions to make, that was the key to them. And I'm extraordinarily proud that I had the opportunity to work with him in attempting to recast the national thinking. But of course he was the president and I was the executive. So I think that's about all I want to say about China at this moment.
So let me move to the, in one way, close at hand, but the other side of the world. I was recently in Europe. I hadn't been there in a while. I was there about maybe 2 months ago. And I was really struck at the discord and discourse that was going on with respect to, and it was mostly a European audience over the weekend, with respect to the United States and the turmoil that we have created, in addition to the challenges they certainly are undergoing. And as recently as certainly this weekend, in fact, when I was there, it was 2 or 3 days after President Macron said NATO was brain dead, which got everybody's attention. I actually viewed that as my own view as a very French statement, as opposed to wasn't overly excited about that, but it certainly stirred everybody up. Angela Merkel is certainly not as strong as she used to be, so the leadership there is changing. Our friends in the UK haven't quite figured out their future as well, in addition to this wave of nationalism which continues to come from Eastern Europe and literally has now affected the whole continent. And then we have our friend Russia, which is always part of the continental equation over there. And so how do you see, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have never imagined that I'd be sitting here asking you a question about Europe and instability and relationships and institutions. But that's a fundamental part of seemingly what's going on now. And have we seen this before? Obviously, you have a rich history. Are there things going on that we should recognize, and is there a way to look at those things now and look to the future about stability, relationships on that continent as well?
If we look at the world, there are 2 huge problems. One is the rise of China and how to build that into a national strategy. But the second is the disintegration of Europe as a major factor in international relations. For 500 years, the world order was defined by ideas that came out of Europe, by Europe spreading itself, and by the confidence of Europe in itself. In the present world, one of the big challenges is the reluctance of European countries to assume responsibility for the larger issues. They have withdrawn to a large extent into their national concerns, and this leaves a big hole in the international system, because it makes us the principal defender of an area that should be able to take over a large share of its own responsibility. but even more important than that, that contributed thinking to how the world order should be constructed. On my last day in China on this trip, one of the leading Chinese said he had made an analysis of the world for himself of the differences between China and the Western countries. And he said the Western countries had been built on religious faith and therefore believed in absolute values and therefore fought against each other for these principles. China believed in the harmony of the society and therefore divided the world in a different way. But this Europe, that was a pretty fair description, which, if you look at history books, had conducted its affairs with a great willingness to make sacrifices, maybe an excessive willingness to make sacrifices, has now focused itself very much on its domestic issues. And I have sympathy for President Trump asking for a fulfillment of the 2%, but that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is for what purpose the Europeans want to act in the world. And in that respect, I have sympathy for what Macron was saying, that it's not a question of getting more weapons, which of course would be highly desirable. But when you look at the upheavals that are likely to occur all over the world, if Europe does not feel that it has a stake in them itself, the pressures on the United States will become very great. So I think one of the big challenges we face is whether we can reconstruct this idea of Atlantic partnership with which we started, but which has been, and in which we are not the people. We have sometimes made mistakes and been over-exuberant, but at least we have continued to believe in the importance of a world order based on these transatlantic principles. So I would say at the heart of it, that's the problem in Europe. Who would have thought that a British government, after winning an election, would come up with Brexit? And now the German structure is weakening. So this seems to me that the key challenge before us, or a key challenge before us, and it will be a principal element in dealing with the Asian evolution.
So, Dr. Kissinger, one last question, and I'd like to bring it home if I can. One of my big concerns over the last several years has been the incredible pressure, the public condemnation of institutions. I mean, briefly, we mentioned NATO, which is obviously struggling, but if I were going to bring it here, we have many institutions that are under enormous pressure at the State Department, the Intel world, FBI, our media, et cetera. But I'd actually like to ask you a question about the ongoing impeachment, having nothing to do with results or individuals per se, because you were one of the few people very close to President Nixon, in that time frame. And what the question is what should we understand based on what you observed to the office of the presidency back in that time frame, that as we go through this process, that this institution, anything we should try to understand with respect to the institution of the office of the presidency as we proceed through our country's fourth impeachment process to whatever the results will be.
That's a very difficult question.
I know, but you're a very smart man.
Let me let me try to answer it on several levels. I don't think the impeachment process was designed for what happened under Watergate and what is happening now. That is to say, the question of how the system responds to a chief executive who acts unwisely and perhaps even wrongly. I believe that the founders meant that if a chief executive acts wrongly over a sustained period of time and sets up principles, that then the system should respond. In the first 280 years of our existence, there was only one impeachment process, and that was in the Civil War.
Right.
When it's built into the system so that it becomes a way of disagreeing with the president, then it's a different order of magnitude. And one of its consequences is, in my observation, in 1973, when Nixon's second term started, we thought we had the international system in a position where we could pursue positive American purposes from a very strong balance of power. That was the basic thought. But when that process gained momentum, even granting that Nixon made many mistakes, what it did was that almost all the public servants had to address in each instance of an action how that could be interpreted over a period of time. And more emphasis was put on short range rather than on long range considerations. So one of the greatnesses of our system is that we encapsulate in the president enormous symbolic and actual authority. And of course, the president has a responsibility to live up to it. But life is ambiguous, and it is possible that one makes moves for a positive set of intentions that the system could not sustain if you made them the rule. So it is understandable that we address that question, but I think when this present crisis is over, we should try to achieve some nonpartisan approach to the dilemma of errors by presidents without destroying the presidency. Leaving open the impeachment clause, but making it less usable for lower levels. I have no answer to this, but to throw the country into the possibility of the sort of division that one has seen is to weaken us partly for our best purposes, because whatever selfish motives are involved, it's a real consideration how to keep the standards at the highest level to the moral qualities we demand. But given the importance of the United States and the enormous the quality that we have shown, and that I try to mention in the Vietnam type of example, the willingness of Americans to dedicate themselves to service for their country. This image of America should be maintained and should not be sacrificed to however reasonable attempts to correct specific errors.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your wisdom. We appreciate that. Okay. All right. Don't get up.
Well, I'm reminded by Dr. Kissinger's remarks that years ago I wrote a long piece on him in the New Republic, and I got a letter from one of his contemporaries, Stanley Hoffman, who said that, while I might have said that Kissinger was the most innovative, surely Sam Huntington was no slouch. But I think tonight, Henry Kissinger has reminded us why he was first among equals in that Harvard class of Huntington, Hoffman, and himself. It is now my pleasure to introduce Senator Rand Paul, who, like me, was apparently, he was born in Pittsburgh, I saw today. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and recently, when I was there this past weekend, I saw the new film about Fred Rogers. And it made me think today that, in fact, when it comes to foreign policy, the movie has it dead wrong, and Senator Paul exemplifies an understanding of why it is not a beautiful neighborhood out there in the rest of the world. And Senator Paul is a close confidant of Donald Trump. He is also apparently, as I noted today, I think one of the senators who has voted most frequently against President Trump's own nominees. But my understanding is that this too may not necessarily have unendeared him to President Trump, given the president's own comments on the members of his administration in the past weeks. So, with that, I would like to welcome Senator Paul to address us.
What a great conversation. I just want to be very brief and thank the Center for National Interest for hosting this conversation and really for being a forum for disruptive ideas. I think that often we talk in Washington about this bipartisan consensus on foreign policy, and I actually get worried when I hear that because I think of Irving Janis's comments about groupthink, and I think so many in both parties are all thinking the same things, and I'm kind of a contrarian. And I don't pretend that everyone will agree with me, but I like to provoke people. So this week I was in a committee, and an Undersecretary of State was there, and I decided, well, why not ask the question? Shouldn't somebody ask this question? I said, do you think sanctions work? And he said, well, and I said, well, do we have any specific examples? We've been putting sanctions on Russia for nearly a decade now. Can you tell me a specific behavior that has changed in Russia's behavior because of sanctions? No. I said, well, do we have negotiations with Russia? Because if sanctions are to work, if our goal is to change behavior, do we have negotiations with them that says, if you do X, we will do Y? No. And then I asked one more question. This is the only one I got, I think, a reasonable answer. I said, do you think it's a good idea for Congress to have sanctions that the president cannot relieve? And he answered very quickly to that, no. And here's a reason why you shouldn't have sanctions that the president can't relieve. We have these CAATSA sanctions on Russia. They're done by Congress and the president can't relieve them. Well, who from Congress is negotiating with Russia? No one. No one from Congress is even traveling to Russia. Very few are, because they're forbidden from traveling to Russia because we forbid the Russians from traveling to visit us. So we have about 28 members of the Duma and the Federation of Russia that can't come and visit us. And so they do the same to us. It's tit for tat. That's the game. And yet, when someone tries to put something forward, I said, let's do one small step. Let's let them come here if they let us come here. Tit for tat, but in a positive way of engagement. You know how many votes I got for that? In the committee, it was like 22 people. I was the only one to vote for that. So there really is a problem. There is a problem where we need disruptive ideas, and you may disagree with me, but my goodness, we've got to do something. Diplomacy has to involve the stick, but it's got to involve a carrot. The only time I can think of in recent times maybe that sanctions worked was bringing Iran to the table, but there was also engagement involved. You could also perhaps say that recently, with regard to Turkey, that Turkey's incursion we disapproved of. The president threatened sanctions, and then when the incursion stopped and there was conversations, the sanctions were removed. There has to be a trade. There has to be X for Y. What will you do if we do this? But I think we live in a world where we have unrealistic expectations. We now have unrealistic expectations for Iran. We have unrealistic expectations for Russia. What we need to do is divide into what our expectations are, find things that we might be able to exchange to move forward, but there needs to be some voice for engagement. I think there is some bipartisanship on this, but I would say that we are the minority. It is the consensus. When the president said, we've been at war too long, that great nations don't fight perpetual wars, when the president said that, it indicated that we might come home from either Afghanistan or Syria. What did the bipartisan consensus in the Senate say? From the Republican leader to the Democrat leader to 77 members of the Senate, they said it would be precipitous to come home from Afghanistan. Precipitous after 19 years? So we need more voices. And while I'm not saying the Center for National Interest agrees with anything I just said, but I am saying they are a forum for allowing these voices to be heard, and for that I thank you.
I'd like to thank Senator Paul for his incisive remarks and commendation, and deliver a toast to 25 more years of the Center for the National Interest. Thank you.